be interesting, I think, studying for the next few months. I say few, couple of months, maybe a little over that. But I'd highly recommend, in order to prep your mind for the sermons that's going to happen in the next few months, to read the Sermon on the Mount. When I first took up the charge of trying to figure out how I could preach through the book of Matthew, I had challenges, I think, a little greater than that of preaching through John. John seems like a very flowing, conversant narrative where you go from one side of Jesus' life to the next in a smooth fashion. In Matthew, his point in teaching to the Jews what they needed to do to be Christians and how they needed to change who they were to become God's new people, it's very spotty and jumpy. In fact, it's not even chronological in some ways. But it's interesting to me that there are places in Matthew that are unlike any other in the Bible. In fact, Matthew, the 5th chapter, in this Sermon on the Mount, the greatest speech ever. I mean, puts to shame anything Lincoln could have ever said. Puts to shame Cicero and Plato and all of these wise fellows. Jesus is referenced in this Sermon on the Mount more than anyone on the planet ever. This is impactful to humanity. And so I want to break this down a little bit, and I'm going to, I know, more than normal disappoint you. I know sometimes my sermons are disappointing, but there's going to be even more than that, because there's no way to cover the Sermon on the Mount. My son in South Africa preaches down there at Ashley Gardens, and he went 2 months solid teaching just these first 12 verses. And I'm going to do it in 30 minutes, maybe. It's just not fair. Okay, we need to have a study of Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount particularly sometime. But what I want to do is look at the big paradigm, because this is really kind of the beginning of Jesus' last will and testament. Now, I realized back in last week we talked about chapter 4, verse 17. From the time that he went up to Capernaum on the seaside in Galilee, he began to teach and to preach. And we find in chapter 4, verse 23 through 25, great multitudes following him. And I can understand that, but we need to picture the setting of what he says here when he says, seeing the multitudes. Where does that come from? Well, it comes from that previous section of verses. And when he says here, seeing the multitudes, this is not an understatement. Okay? I mean, not an overstatement. If anything, it's an understatement, because how many people do you think would be interested in a guy that's going through and healing those who are afflicted of diseases, verse 24 in chapter 4, who has healed people of diseases, torments, paralytics, epileptics, those who are possessed of demons? He was doing miracles. I'm telling you, if old Horn came through the door here, jumping and, dancing around saying, hey, you ain't going to believe what this guy I found out here put my leg back on. And I don't have problems with my right side being paralyzed from a stroke. Would you want to know who the guy was? I would. I'd be running out to find this fellow that could make Mike like that. My brother's struggling right now. And if somebody could make him well, it just annoys me when miracle workers, so-called, spout off about how they can do miracles today. I got a friend that's hurting right now. You get yourself over here if you think you can do anything. I got somebody that needs to see you. What a farce that people would claim to do those kind of things. There's no miracles today like that. Or we wouldn't have all the diseases and sickness. I got tickled. Somebody mentioned Oral Roberts in class, and I'm not one to name names while I'm preaching that much, but on this occasion it's worthy of it. Oral Roberts screaming and hollering at his people, send me money to build my hospital. If you don't, God will take me. And my thinking was, go for it. I'm good with that. And besides that, if you can do all those miracles, what do you need a hospital for? What a contradiction. Jesus was doing this kind of thing. Can you believe multitudes would follow him? Well, duh, yes. There would be tons of multitudes. But I want you to notice that, as according to Hebrews 2, 3, and 4, the reason these miracles transpired, the reason they occurred, and even Jesus himself, the reason he did them, was not because somebody needed a leg or somebody was blind and needed to see. That was not the motivation. The motivation was to prove, I'm God, I can do this, and so when I tell you something, you should listen. And that's what we're getting introduced to right here when he sees the multitudes, and he went up on the mountain where he could be heard, and he was seated, and his disciples came to him. Now, I can imagine that the crowd was full of folks that had been sick and been healed, and some who was looking to be healed of their sicknesses and their problems. I can imagine people being there because this guy can do stuff no one else can. Never man spake like this man. Things that he had been talking about concerning the kingdom that he'd already talked about. They were willing to hear. They were ready to hear what he said. And I'm looking at our culture today, and here we have it, and nearly every family in the country has a Bible sitting on their table or somewhere in their home. And here we have the most beautiful words ever written, and who reads them? Why is it that the bread of life is so available and people are starving, literally dying of starvation spiritually, when we have here the beautiful and wondrous words of Jesus, the Son of the living God? And people don't read it. I'd encourage you for the next few months, we're going to be talking about, a couple of months, we're going to be talking about these 3 chapters here. The Sermon on the Mount. Read it. It won't hurt you to read it twice or 25,000 times. It's good stuff. You'll find something new in it. I'll guarantee it. Every time you read it, you'll find something you didn't see before. You'll see a depth you have not seen before. You know, folks, that's the nature of Jesus' words. When you read his words, there is a superficial meaning for us dummies. But us dummies, if we'll just stick with it and read it more, we'll get to a depth we never believed we could get to, because he has so much to say to you and me, and so impactful, so valid. There's not a vain word in Jesus' mouth. As he begins the Sermon on the Mount, folks, there is guys who have studied this, who have written tomes. I've got a 3-volume set in my library over nothing but the Sermon on the Mount. 3 volumes! And I don't believe he does it justice, frankly, because there's so much that can be said about Jesus' words in this sermon. We're about to begin a study of the greatest prose ever written on the planet. It would do us well to understand where we're coming from long before we get there. And the Nehemiah 8:8, you know, Nehemiah, as someone mentioned even in class, how the children of Israel had not heard the Bible for a long time. Nehemiah gets up and reads it. Nehemiah 8:8, not only does he read it, but he gives the sense of it. I'm going to try my best in this next few months to give the sense of what Jesus is saying here. Now, the first one today is going to be very generic, because I divided up as he introduces himself and says, here's what you need to know, because that's what the miracles were for. I want to get you over here to show you I'm God. Now, listen to what I have to say. And what is his first message? What is the beginning of his message to people? It's what our elders have been pushing us about for, oh, how long? Get your attitude right. That's his first thing. And that's why I love preaching sermons like this, because I can see you and what you're wearing and whether you're smiling or snoozing or whatever during my sermon. Okay, I can see that, but I can't see your heart. But God can. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go through these Beatitudes, because we're talking about attitudes, and God knows your attitude. You can hide it from me. You can hide it from your friends. You might even hide it from your near spouse or your kids. You can do that. If you're good at it, you can hide a lot of it, but you can't hide from God. And so Jesus starts at the very root, the base, the foundation of who we are going to be. And that's what he's telling us here in his last will and testament that Jesus is beginning to really flesh out. He is starting with that most important thing about who we are as Christians. If you haven't got your attitude right, I don't care what you do, it's not going to be acceptable to God if your attitude is not right. And yeah, we can have our attitude right and do things wrong, and that happens sometimes, and pity on us when that happens. We need to get things done right, and I appreciate that. But the foundation of it all is you got to have your attitude right. And there are all kinds of ways those things are manifested. That attitude is manifested in the way we act, in the way we speak. I mean, it's just hard to, say some things without it being taken as, boy, that's somebody's snarky, or somebody got up on a bad hair day. Those kinds of things slip out. But honestly, truly, God knows your heart. And I'll tell you, if it doesn't scare you, if you're not living the way you ought to live, it ought to, because when you stand before the judgment seat of Christ, it's not going to matter what you wore, not going to matter what you did profession-wise in this world, not going to matter how rich you were, how poor you were, who was your kinfolk, or who your daddy and mommy is. That doesn't matter. You know what's going to matter? Your attitude. What was your attitude toward God? How did you live in this life? Did you just ignore him because your attitude was, whatever? You know, like many kids do these days with their parents. Yeah, that's just mom and dad. Nah. And they just discount it and go on with their life. Total disrespect. Is that the way we do very often in our country with our government? Our government has not been great here for the past few years. But you know what? God set governments in order, Romans 13, 1 and following. And we have to have respect for the position and for the office because that's who we are as Americans. But most personally and associated with that is we're Christians. And so therefore we want to do what is right by our government. But we have a whole culture that's totally disrespectful of the government and doesn't pay attention to laws, doesn't care. Where's that? Well, that's just a manifestation of an attitude. That's all that is. And so therefore, when he starts speaking these profound words, that's going to change the lives of every person on earth from this point forward, he starts with attitude. Now, I don't have time. I would love to, but I don't have time to go into these in great detail, so I'm going to kind of lump them together and put them under big umbrellas. And that's how we're going to look at these Beatitudes. But I invite you to study these in much more detail, and I'll give you scripture here and there once in a while just to kind of give you a lead as to where you can go with the study. But when he sat down, and by the way, I always have found it interesting that when Jesus preached his Sermon on the Mount, he sat down. Well, that was a cultural thing, really. Cultural thing back in the day. Anybody of wisdom, anybody of teaching status in that day, that was one of the signature characteristic things that a teacher would do. You sat down, and everyone else came and sat down a little bit lower than you so that they could learn and look up to you. When Jesus went up on the mountain, and just to get the setting correct here on this, it was in Capernaum, it was by the Sea of Galilee, and there were some outjutting rocks. It is very likely Jesus went up on one of those outjutting rocks to be able to be seen by those, and that's the purpose of his doing so. There was no elevation in his stature at that particular time to raise himself above that. That was not the point. He wasn't getting up there to be, see, look at me. I love the setup we have here in this little building for preaching, where there isn't a podium. You notice it's just on the ground because I ain't somebody, okay? I ought not to be on a podium of any kind. I have this one folded up because I don't like standing up a little higher than everybody else when it's not necessary for you to hear me. Evidently, I talk too much and I'm pretty loud, so I can be heard. I don't need to be elevated. And we should not elevate anyone in the church to that degree or in that way. We're all brethren. We're all equal. We're all working together in unity in this. It's just my job happens to be the one that talks during this particular portion of the lesson or of the service. And so therefore, you need to be sure your part is just as vital. You need to be sure I'm telling you the truth. So Jesus did this as just a customary thing. I sat down. I get tickled when some folks these days try to emulate certain things in the Bible, like cultural anomalies, that they think is very appropriate to get up to preach a sermon and to sit down. And I think, wow, that's a little bit arrogant, I think. Thinking that you are somebody as a teacher, somebody important, and that's how you're going to signify it, as opposed to standing up and teaching so you can be heard and be understood. But Jesus did this as a cultural anomaly. That was it. And then he opened his mouth and he taught. Now, what did he teach? Well, he started, as I said, with attitudes. And what I'm going to do is divide these 12 verses in half. Because these two verses, clumping them in categories, fit neatly into two directives that Jesus is giving concerning our attitude. Okay? Now, there is depth that we just don't have time to get into, but let me point out the distinction between these two categories. From verse 2, where he opens his mouth, in verse 3, he begins teaching through verse 6. That's the first section, 3 through 6, and this has to do with our attitude toward God. Okay? So when you want to look at this as a big overarching paradigm, it's about our attitude toward God, and then the second part, 7 through 12, is our attitude toward people, men, people. That's the second part of it. And so he's looking at, and of course these, we're not going to flesh them out, but these are really interesting when you start digging in to cross-referencing, and that's what I want to do. I'm going to just give you a taste of the cross-referencing that is there that will help us understand what did he mean when he said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." What does he mean, poor in spirit? Well, turn over with me to James chapter 4, verse 10, and let's look at something that kind of correlates with that. James chapter 4, verse 10. There's a song that our young people sing sometimes at our summer youth series during the summer. Humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and He will lift you up. I'll tell you, that's so counter-revolutionary in our culture because of the way we are inundated with the culture of we're number one. I've used the illustration before, but it tickles me so much. It's so funny, the ignorance involved, and I'm not meaning maliciously ignorant, I'm just saying they don't know. But the guy that's playing in the football game, you've heard me use this illustration, where they're losing 75,000 to nothing, and they finally score a touchdown, and what does the guy do when he runs across the goal line? Holds up, we're number one, way behind number one. You know? We have it just ingrained into our culture, into our being in this country. We're number one. I have no problems with the current political climate of Make America Great. We need to be a great country. But we're not number one. Okay? What we need to do is humble ourselves in the sight of the Lord. And Jesus starts with the very premise and foundation of who we're going to be as Christians to understand it ain't all about me. I'm not number one. In fact is, Paul referenced it well, another reference you can use, Galatians 2:20. I'm crucified with Christ. I'm dead. I'm not here. I'm crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live, but yet not me. It's not about me. I'm going to humble myself and realize that when it really comes down to it, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. But without Christ, and that's the implication to the contrary, without Christ, I can't do anything. And so we need to understand as Christians to start with, it's not about us. In fact, we had a great discussion this morning about witnessing. The very common and very popular idea of telling people about one's conversion experience. And I mean no disrespect, but who cares? I mean no disrespect, but who cares how you were converted? What does that have to do with me? The apostles went everywhere preaching the gospel. That's what saves you. Paul said the power is in the gospel. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God. Well, that's what saves us, not what I experienced or what I felt or how I feel about things. Oh, I started to run off in Boyce's class on that one. I'm glad I shut down. But that's a great point. We don't witness today, but our testimony means nothing. You know, that to me is just a signal of arrogance, and people don't realize that, and I'm not assigning them malice when I say that. I'm just saying they don't realize being a Christian is not about you and me. Being a Christian is about lowering ourselves to become, as Jesus washed the disciples' feet, a servant. That's who we are. And that's all the time I can spend on that one, because it's got a bunch more here to go. But you see what I'm talking about. You can go dig deeply into the well of wealth and knowledge and wisdom in these texts. But Jesus starts with the idea, don't think you're somebody, okay? Your value has to do with your relationship to God, because God made you, and He's the one that said you're valuable. As a matter of fact, that's one of the flaws of atheism. I mean, if we're nothing but glorified cockroaches, we have no value. The only time we do have value is when God says we do. And by the way, we have such value that Jesus, the speaker here, came and died for us while we were yet sinners. So in the second one, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are those who mourn. We're supposed to be like a lot of Christians seem to be. Oh, I want to be a Christian. Anything fun I can't do, because, you know, Christian is not fun. It's just a weariness for my soul that I have to be a Christian. You look at some people, you look at some Christians, and you go, why would I want to be that? The invitation to be a Christian is just not there when they're moping around all the time and they don't know how to smile. Oh, life is horrible, it's terrible. You know, that's not what that means at all. No, what that means is that we have to understand who we are and our experience and recognize our place. And when you do, you will mourn the fact that you ever left God. It reminds me of the time when so faithful Peter was trying to be and had made so many mistakes that Jesus warns him ahead of time so he'll know you're about to, I'm going to get turned over to the law, and when I am, you're going to deny me. Oh, I'll never deny you, Peter would say. And then sitting there by the fire warming himself the third time. Third time he denies Christ. And the cock crows and he hears it and goes, oh no. I don't know whether y'all have ever had those epiphanies, those little moments of total, complete regret. Where you look at yourself and go, oh, I knew better. In some cases, I was told better. I was taught better. And yet here I find myself like the prodigal son, knee deep in quagmire. I'll put it that way. What do I do? Blessed are those who mourn. It is a cognizance of who we are and where we are and what we amount to. 1 Peter 5:7 always comes to mind when I read this, because one of the things we can always count on is when we mourn, when we really see ourselves for who we are and are indeed repentant and sorry that we haven't been what we know we should be, that God will be there. 1 Peter 5:7 says that we need to cast our care on Jesus because he cares for you. That's such a profound statement in Peter. And who better than Peter would know about that being true? Having denied Christ, he goes out and weeps bitterly. I know there was such a dread in his mind of having, people worry about that. Oh, I'm not worth it anymore, like we ever were. I'm not worth it. Look at what I've done. There is no way now what I've done I can be saved. There's no way anybody would forgive me for this. Blessed are those who mourn. You'll be comforted. And so back comes Mary from seeing Jesus, who was told, go tell the disciples and Peter. Peter needed that. You and I need that. Blessed are those who mourn, the individuals who realize who they are and are really sorrowful for what they have been. So blessed are those also who are meek in verse 5. I'm going to go to Psalm 37 because that's where this line comes from. It's a kind of a reference to it. But blessed are the meek. And of course, too, you've heard it many times, meek does not equate to weak. Those are not synonyms. Meek has an attitude of being in control. Okay? But notice where it comes from in Psalm 37, if you would. Look back, Psalm 37, verse 11. And by the way, this entire thing is talking about people being evil, and this is going to segue into the end of these Beatitudes. But don't fret because of evildoers, we're told in 37:1. Don't be envious of works of iniquity. Like the grass, they're going to get cut down. In fact, it is in verse 8, cease from anger, forsake wrath, don't fret. It only causes harm. You're going to get upset about things when people are not right to you. But you'll notice in verse 11 it says, but the meek shall inherit. This is right after he says in verse 10, yet for a little while the wicked are going to prevail. And that's what they do. But the meek shall inherit the earth and shall delight in themselves in the abundance of peace. And that's kind of what this is talking about. The meek are going to be able to deal with the conflicts of life like nobody else can deal because they are submissive to Christ, because they are regretting their sin. And because of that, and God cares for us, he's going to help us get over that to the point that we are conquerors in Christ. Now, all of these phrases I'm using are straight from scriptures in the Bible. I don't reference them at all times, but we are conquerors through Christ. And if you're going to be a conqueror, you need to be meek. You need to allow God to do the conquering for you, because you're not going to be able to do it yourself. But it starts with an attitude. It starts with an attitude of, I'm going to let God. I hear the expression sometimes, give it over to God, let God handle it. That is so much easier said than done. Have you ever noticed that? Maybe it's just me, but it's so much easier to sit and fret and worry and tear up your stomach and get yourself a headache over things that happen in life. I do that. I understand that. It's so much easier to do that than it is to say, God, I'm going to pray about this and turn it over to you, and I'm going to let you handle it for me. I'm just going to go on and do the best I can and be the best I can, and then I know you will take care of me, because as it says here, you'll inherit the earth. And that's just a flowery figurative expression of being, you're going to overcome. In fact, that was the big concern of the children of Israel as they came out of the wilderness. God said, I'm going to give you this land. You're going to inherit all this. I promised it to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you're going to get it all. You want to talk about euphoria? When you know the big present is coming because I've hung in there, I've endured. And so therefore, we ought to be living this as an attitude. And all of these three talk about our attitude, understanding ourselves toward God. We're going to be humble and submit to God. We're going to be meek and realize God's got things in control and so forth and so on. Now the next has to do with people. Because we're Christians, because we're changed, we're different. Romans talks about that prolifically in chapter 6. You know, we're not the same as we used to be. We rose up from the grave to walk a new life. Well, what's that new life? Well, that in the old one, how we used to treat people, it's a new one. Boy, I almost got to it in this class, but you know, how can you in 1 John love God but hate your brother? You know, you've seen your brother. How can you love God whom you've not seen and hate your brother whom you have seen? The point of the logical implication there is you can't. You can't do it. In fact, one of the manifestations of our heart is how we treat each other. And oh boy, I've seen in my time, and as a member of the Lord's body, baptized at 13. Should have been baptized earlier. I knew what I was doing really well by the time I was 13. But I was kind of stubborn. But I caved in because you can't be who you need to be if you're stubborn. You just can't. You know, some people never get over that. They just continue being that way, and it's all about me. And you get them in a group of people, and if I'm not the chief, and if I'm not running the show, if everything's not about me, then I don't want to be a part of this group. And you see that in lots of groups. I've seen churches divide over that. Been involved in a congregation where people just didn't want to follow the book, and it's like, no, we've got to follow the book, guys. And the people who didn't decide to leave, they're going to do something else. I've been involved in those kinds of things. It's ugly. How can anybody be that way if they love their brethren? And so therefore, how are we going to conduct ourselves with our brethren? We're going to love them. We're going to care about them. And here's what Jesus said as a foundation. Here's how you're going to start things off. And I love the way he starts things off about how we treat each other. He says, blessed are the merciful. Now think about the motivation for the mercy that is involved here. You know, why would I be merciful? Well, basically, I did not save myself, pulling myself up by my own bootstraps. Somebody loved me and cared about me. I was just thinking just a minute ago, I mean, we've got Ben up here leading the prayer, and we've got Pete up here reading the scripture. Here in a minute, you know, Jimmy's going to dismiss our assembly. It is an honor to serve with veterans in the Lord's kingdom. Appreciate you old guys, having been around for years, been faithful for years. We got folks who have struggled through their lives, but they're faithful, they're sticking with it. You're such an encouragement for those of us who, and I'm really stretching it, I know, but those of us who are younger, okay, I'm trying. But the whole point being, blessed are the merciful. They have a cognizance of who they really are. It has to do with the individuals who realize that I need to show the same kind of attitude toward others, because that's Christ in me, that God has shown to me. God so loved the world. While we were yet sinners, God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son. Now, you should be saved because of that. A lot of folk won't. In fact, Jesus says so. But the reason they won't is because they haven't learned that you didn't do it yourself. It's not about you or your testimony or your experience. It's about God in your life. And so, therefore, we shall obtain mercy. Eventually, we shall obtain mercy. And we'll get to that here in just a minute. But blessed are those who have a pure heart. Once again, Psalm 15 is a great one to go to. That one, Psalm 15, verse 2, the pure in heart. Psalm 15, the question is asked to begin this psalm. And I've always thought, you know, when we're sitting here worshiping, guys, okay, we're worshiping. And during the course of this worship here, God knows your heart, okay? You know, have you got a pure heart? That's the question to be asked, because in the Old Testament in Psalm 15, David goes, Lord, who may abide in your tabernacle? Who may dwell in your holy hill? Now, this is all poetry, so this is figurative of those who are acceptable to God. Those who come before God to sacrifice and worship. Who's acceptable? Well, here we go. He who walks uprightly, who works righteousness, who speaks the truth in his heart. That's where it comes from, you see. Pureness of heart. If you haven't got a pure heart, I may not be able to tell, okay? Because the manifestations of an impure heart may not be just totally evident. God knows. And how we treat each other ought to be that way. You ought to have a pure heart. Your motives for what you do and say to and with your brothers and sisters in Christ ought to be motivated by purity. Now, I know for a fact, because I've been treated the best in my life by the brethren of the Lord's body. Best people in the world I've known have been never, and the worst people and the ones who have treated me worse than anybody have claimed to be brethren in the Lord's church. I don't know whether you've had that experience. I sure have in my career as a Christian. And I don't understand how anybody can do that if you've got a pure heart. How can you say what you're saying with a pure heart? It's mean, it's ugly, it's destructive. How can you do what you're doing and shame the Lord's body out there in this community the way you live? I don't understand how that can happen either. Oh, folks, we have to start with the idea that we're going to have a pure heart, and we're going to have that toward each other, because that's what we have to have toward God. How are we going to deal with each other? Straight up, straightforward, with love and kindness. How can you love God and hate your brother? The question remains. Also, we're going to be peacemakers. You know, Romans 12, I love that verse. There's so many little nuances to that verse in Romans 12:18. You know, it tells us that we ought to get along with everybody that we can, as much as lies within you. Okay? It starts with us. As much as lies within you, be at peace with all men. We ought to be peacemakers. You know those kind of people that love to argue? I mean, just pick your side, pick your subject, they'll argue with you. Just the way they do. They're so fun to be around, aren't they? Or those cynics that every time you turn around, they find something wrong with you. And they're allowed to just tell you, because it's important that you know you're terribly wrong. Don't you just love to be around those kind of people? You know, peacemakers are the kind of folk that want to get along, and if you want to get along, we'll get along. We'll be okay. We won't agree on everything, but when we don't, if it's a matter of doctrine, we'll go to God and find out what God tells both of us, and then we'll agree, because we're smart folk. We can figure it out. If it's a matter of opinion, well, that's not a big deal. If you got your opinion and I got mine, that's the beauty of having the variety and diversity in the body of Christ, where people are not all identical automatons, all exactly the same. I'm glad you're different than me. I'm glad you got skills I don't have. It makes this church stronger when you're a little different than me. And trust me, when it comes to technology, I'm so glad we got some people here that I'm looking in the camera at, because I would be hopeless when it comes to technology. I'm so happy and thankful for the skill set you bring to the table. Further, and this is the biggie, okay? As a matter of fact, this is something to note, okay? When Jesus is going through there, he just makes these generic, overarching, tremendously powerful statements, and then he goes to the next one. I'm just almost abruptly goes to the next one. On this one, he says, blessed are those who are persecuted, and then he spends 2 more verses fleshing that out. Now, you ever wonder why all of this stuff about how we relate to God and how we relate to humanity, how is humanity going to respond? And that's how this last one is a little different. Because it's how our attitude is toward God, how our attitude is toward humanity. And the hard one, well, the hard one, let's be honest, and Jesus preps us for it, okay? He gives a lot of detail about it. When you're nice to somebody, they're liable to slap your face. They sure enough are. They're liable to get angry with you because you're not doing what they want, or saying what they want, or allowing them to be who they want. My friends, we're going to be persecuted. It is not a maybe, it is not a if, it's not, oh, maybe sometimes not. No, you're going to be persecuted when you choose Christ, okay? And we just got to understand that when we're persecuted, and by the way, it's when we're saying all kinds of evil against us falsely. In verse 11, 1 Peter 2:20 talks about the fact that if somebody says something about you that's bad and it's true, shame on you, okay? They ought not to be able to say stuff about you that's true and it's not flattering, okay? But when they say stuff about you falsely, and they will. I have discovered as a preacher, because I don't have a lot of money, I'm not good looking, I'm not popular. I mean, I can go on and on about what I'm not, but you know what I am? I got integrity. And I've been fired twice in my preaching career because I'm going to teach the truth. I don't care if the hair lips the governor. I'm going to teach the truth. I have that integrity. But you know how you can really warp that integrity? You can start an ugly rumor about Jeff and pass it around. Because there's always gossips ready to hear. And there's always somebody, ooh, they want to get dirt on somebody else. And you know what? After it's all over, they can come back and say, oh, my bad. I didn't mean to say that. Well, that doesn't change the damage you did to a guy's good name. I know that. Maybe you have too. And you know what, as Christians, trust me, they may not poke a spear through you like Phinehas did to the evil fellow that walked into their assembly. Don't expect that here at Park Heights. Nobody will poke you with a spear. But I'll tell you what we are going to do. Don't poke us with a verbal spear either. We ought not to be talking bad about each other. We ought not to be talking bad about anyone who is trying to serve God. We need to encourage them and lift them up. And when he talks about people talking falsely about us, that's going to happen to you by people who do not want the truth. Get ready for it. In fact, you should live such a stellar life that when they talk about you as evil, they end up being ashamed and shown for who they are, because everybody's looking around going, why are they saying this guy's done that? He doesn't do that. We know him. We know what he or she is about. We know how they are. Now, that's not true. In fact, the problem is with the yah-yah mouth that's going off over there saying bad things. That's what needs to happen. Folks, you're going to get persecuted. If there's any consolation in that, the conclusion of verse 12, take some comfort in the fact that, for eons, those who have had these kinds of attitude, the prophets, for eons, they've been persecuted. Oh, go back to the prophets of old. Dig into the Old Testament and look at what some of the prophets had to deal with. Don't have time to go into it. Good place to go is the last part of Hebrews 11. Oh, you find people that are getting sawn and asunder, stoned. All kinds of bad things happen to be because they love God and serve God. As Jesus begins, he said, you need to be of such commitment and conviction that you're like the prophets of old. Now, there's an implication there, because you're going to need to read these 3 chapters as we go through this series in the next few months. But I'd invite you to read, what Amos put up with, and what Hosea put up. Malachi, he's trying to teach people, and they're going, he's saying, y'all not doing right, you're not sacrificing God. Well, how have we not sacrificed? Haven't you guys as teachers heard that from a kid class? What do you mean I'm wrong? You're going to get persecution. Okay, it's going to happen. But the prophets were persecuted, and we just need to resign ourselves that the joy we have as Christians has to do with a foundational, deep attitude of submission to God, understanding he cares for you. We have a hope in heaven. So Jesus begins his last will and testament by saying, get your attitude right. Now, this is beautiful for me to invite you as an invitation song that Jesus is inviting you, because I don't know what's going on inside your mind. I really don't. But I would highly recommend that you do some soul searching and understand God sees your mind. You can fool me all you want, okay? But you can't fool God. The song of encouragement is a tradition that we have. It's a right scriptural tradition, actually, to invite people to obey the gospel. If you've not obeyed the gospel, you need to. Now, if you're out of duty and you have not been faithfully attending the Lord's service and being his child, check your attitude, because I'll guarantee you, of all the things that's going on, the distractions and the hindrances and all of that, somewhere down there it comes out. Somewhere my attitude has not been the way it ought to be, or I would be in the assembly of the saints praising God this morning. Now, I'm preaching to the choir, obviously, y'all are here. So, our job would be to go out and encourage people who are not here and say, oh, you're missing the foundation of what Jesus wanted in his people, the good attitude. If you want to respond in any way, we invite you to stand.